He found her curled against the base of a spruce tree 100 yards from the cabin, lips, blue eyes drifting shut. The blizzard had swallowed the world in white. He had 40 minutes of rope and nothing else. He lifted her, and she weighed nothing in his arms, and he walked back into the storm because his life did not make sense anymore without her in it. She was a mail-order bride from Philadelphia. He was a mountain man who had not spoken to another soul in years. And the letter that brought her to him had been written by someone else entirely. This is the story of the bride of Harrow Ridge. The young clerk behind the front desk at Leadville Savings looked up when the door opened, and what he saw made no sense at all. A small woman in a mud-spattered emerald green dress, honey blonde hair, escaping its pins, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, walked past him without a word and headed straight for the office in the back where Harlan Crane conducted his business. She moved with the quiet grace of a woman who had learned very young how to stand in rooms full of men who were bigger and louder and more powerful than she would ever be. The clerk stammered, "Ma'am, you cannot just walk in there without an appointment." She did not stop. She did not even slow down. She pushed open Crane's office door and stepped inside as if she owned the building and had simply forgotten to mention it. Harlan Crane sat behind his mahogany desk, his gold-rimmed spectacles catching the thin spring light that came through the window. His vest was pressed, his hair was oiled and combed. He looked like a man who had never once broken a sweat, and he smiled the way men smile when they know the numbers are on their side. 2 weeks earlier, when the pass had finally opened, after 5 months of snow, he had sent a letter up the mountain to Bow and Harrow. 3 weeks. That was all the time remaining before he took everything. The land, the cabin, the livestock, that worthless forge. All of it. He had not received a reply. He did not expect one. Men like Harrow did not write letters. They simply lost. Crane was leaning back in his chair, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a man whose traps are well set when the door to his office opened. "You will get your money," the woman said. Her voice was soft, but it did not waver. "But first let us discuss your arithmetic, because according to my calculations, you are charging interest above the rate permitted by federal law." The room went silent. The clock on the wall ticked. Harlan Crane looked at her, and for the first time something shifted behind those gold-rimmed spectacles. This moment would save them all or destroy everything. But before you hear how it ended, you need to hear how it began. Stay with us until the very last word of this story, and drop a comment telling us where you are listening from tonight so we can see just how far this story travels. This is the story of the bride of Harrow Ridge. 6 months earlier, autumn 1878, the dust had not yet settled from the stagecoach wheels when Wren Whitfield realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. Leadville, Colorado Territory, a mining town perched at 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air was so thin it made her lungs burn with every breath. She stepped down from the coach, and her head swam, her vision going bright at the edges, and she gripped the door handle until the world steadied. The main street was churned mud from last night's rain. Sawdust and horse dung and cheap whiskey mingled in the air, and everywhere she looked she saw men with soot-blackened faces, men who had crawled up from the silver mines, and now stood blinking in the afternoon light like moles surfacing from the earth. They watched her pass the way wolves watch a fawn that has wandered from the herd. She was wearing her navy blue traveling dress. Philadelphia fabric, Philadelphia tailoring, utterly useless in a place like this. Her gloved hands trembled, not from the cold, though the September air at this altitude was sharper than any January she had known back east, but from fear. This was not her world. The letter had said, "Cattle ranch near Leadville." The letter had said, "Solid home." The letter had said, "Simple life, but a good one." The letter had not mentioned that near Leadville meant 45 miles of mountain road. It had not mentioned that Labat and home meant a 3-room log cabin at 9,000 feet elevation. And the letter most certainly had not mentioned that she would be living with 3 men instead of 1. They were standing by the coach station, 3 of them. She had expected 1 man, 1 husband. The advertisement had been clear. Practical, hard-working wife needed for mountain homestead. Honest man seeks honest partner. Not beauty, but truth. Instead, 3 giants stood before her in the muddy street of Leadville, each one towering 1.5 feet above her shoulders, twice her width, hands the size of her face. They looked like they had been carved from the same mountain stone, weathered and massive, and utterly out of place in any world she had ever known. The one in front removed his hat. It was wide-brimmed, sweat-stained, fraying at the edges, and without it she could see a face that the land had carved deeper than his 33 years deserved. Square jaw, several days of stubble, amber eyes so deep they looked like whiskey held up to firelight. A faded scar ran along his chin, old and white from some accident, with a falling tree long ago. Miss Whitfield. His voice was lower than she had imagined. It sounded like gravel rolling along a creek bed. I am Bowen Harrow. Wren looked from Bowen to the other two, and the careful composure she had maintained across 2,000 miles of stagecoach travel began to crack. Your letter, she said steadier than she felt, did not mention an extended family. Bowen opened his mouth, but the second man cut him off. He was slightly shorter than Bowen, leaner, with muscles that were sharper and harder from forge work. His hair was nearly black, his eyes the color of a storm approaching over open water, and everything about him radiated suspicion. His arms were crossed over his chest, and a light burn scar marked his right forearm. My brother also forgot to mention that we live 45 miles up a mountain road with no neighbors, and that winter up here kills people faster than anything you have ever seen in Philadelphia. Silas. The name came from Bowen like a warning. The third one stepped forward. He was the tallest of the three, the youngest, with dark blonde hair tied loosely at his neck and warm green eyes that seemed fundamentally incapable of hostility. He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Wren had seen since she left the East Coast. Do not let Silas scare you. He bites strangers, but he does not carry rabies. He winked. I am Emmett. Welcome to Colorado, Miss Whitfield. The journey must have been exhausting. Wren looked at all three of them. Then she looked around Leadville. Then she looked down at her white Philadelphia gloves. Then she looked back at Bowen. Your letter said you needed a companion, she said. A partner. Not a pretty face, but a real person. I traveled 2,000 miles because of those words. She drew a deep breath, and the thin air made her dizzy. I deserve at least to see the place I would be living before I decide. Bowen nodded slowly. Fair enough. He reached for her two trunks and lifted them as if they weighed nothing, setting them into the back of a weathered wagon. 45 miles. We will arrive before dark if we leave now. The road up to Harrow Ridge was not a road. It was a pair of wagon ruts carved through a forest of Engelmann spruce, climbing relentlessly, winding around cliff faces, where the drop was 500 feet of empty air and sharp stone below. Wren gripped the edge of the wagon seat and closed her eyes when the wheels slipped near the edge, and she felt the vast, indifferent weight of the mountain beneath her like a sleeping giant that could shrug them all into nothing. But the beauty, God, the beauty. The spruce trees rose straight and tall, their dark green canopy filtering the afternoon sun into columns of golden dust. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth and something ancient, something that had been here long before any human being set foot on this continent. Somewhere below and to the right, a creek rushed over stones, its voice echoing up the canyon walls. And every so often the road opened to a vista that stopped her breath entirely. The Sawatch Range stretched to the horizon peak after white-capped peak, glittering under a sky so blue it looked like stained glass. Bowen sat beside her on the wagon seat, guiding the horses with the absent ease of a man who had traveled this path 1,000 times. He did not speak much. When he did, each sentence carried weight as if words were a limited resource that had to be spent carefully. My father, Elijah Harrow, came here in 1856, before the Leadville Silver Rush, before the railroad, before any of it. He found a valley at 9,000 feet, low enough for cattle, high enough that nobody would bother him. He built a cabin with his own hands, planted an apple orchard because his wife missed Virginia. What happened to him? Wren asked. Winter, 4 years ago. Bowen did not elaborate, but Wren saw his jaw tighten, his neck go rigid. She understood. There were griefs that frontier men buried deeper than wells. Silas rode his own horse alongside the wagon, keeping distance, his gray eyes constantly scanning the tree line. It was the habit of a man who lived where grizzlies and mountain lions were the actual neighbors. Emmett sat in the back of the wagon, his long legs dangling over the tailgate, whistling a tune Wren did not recognize. They rode in silence for a long time. Then Wren spoke. My father was Frederick Whitfield, a merchant in Philadelphia. Her voice went flat mechanical, the self-defense mechanism she had developed over 2 years of living inside a scandal. His partner, a man named Aldridge, embezzled from the company and blamed my father for it. The scandal was spectacular. Headlines in every newspaper. A trial that lasted 8 months. She paused. My father died in prison, waiting for his appeal. His heart gave out. Did he do it? Bowen asked. The question came out before he could stop it. No. Immediate, fierce, absolute. He was many things, proud, sometimes foolish. But he was not a thief. He was betrayed by a man he trusted. Silence. Just the sound of hooves on stone, the creak of the wagon wind in the spruce branches. Out here, Bowen said slowly, his voice quiet, nobody cares who your father was or what he was accused of doing. Out here, people only care whether you can survive the winter. From the back of the wagon, Emmett spoke gently. Losing a father. We understand that. I am sorry, Miss Whitfield. Silas said nothing. But Wren noticed that he edged his horse a little closer to the wagon, as if her words had shortened a distance he did not want to acknowledge. Harrow Ridge appeared as the sun began its descent, and Wren had to fight the instinct to turn the wagon around. The cabin was built of spruce logs stacked and chinked with moss and river clay. 3 rooms. The main room held a stone hearth fireplace, a rough-hewn wooden table, and 2 chairs. Not 4. 2. The back room had a bed frame strung with rope and covered with coarse wool blankets. The smallest room held a bunk bed that Silas and Emmett shared, clothes hanging on nails driven into the walls. The barn leaned to the right, its roof desperate for repair before winter. Inside it smelled of hay and leather and cattle. Silas's forge stood 30 yards from the cabin, and it was the only structure on the entire property that gleamed with proper maintenance. The anvil was polished, the hammers hung in precise order, the coal stacked neatly. This was Silas's kingdom, and he kept it the way a soldier keeps his weapon. The apple orchard covered 4 acres on the eastern slope where the land tilted down toward the creek. The trees had gone half wild, their branches tangled, and unpruned fruit hanging ripe and heavy, or rotting on the ground because nobody had time to harvest it. But the trees were still bearing. And Wren, the daughter of a merchant, saw potential where the brothers saw only more work they could not manage. 35 head of cattle grazed in the low pasture, 12 cows, 4 horses, less than half the herd Elijah had built before he died. The fences around the grazing land needed mending in at least 20 places. Wren stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle. The 3 brothers waited, Bowen anxious, Silas defiant, Emmett hopeful. She looked at the listing barn, the broken fences, the wild orchard, and she saw something she did not expect. She saw her father's house, not the Philadelphia mansion, but the spirit of it, the will of a man who had built everything from nothing. Frederick Whitfield had built a trading empire from bare hands. Elijah Harrow had built a ranch from wilderness. Same breed of man, same breed of dream. It is yours, Wren said quietly. Your father built it. That makes it everything. Something cracked open in Bowen's chest. Some wall he had built over 4 years of loss and failure. This woman, this small Philadelphia lady who should have taken one look at his failing ranch and demanded the next coach east, was looking at his broken-down homestead as if it mattered, as if it were worth saving. That night they sat around the table for the first time. Emmett had cooked, elk stew and beans, rough bread baked on the iron stove. 4 people at a table built for 2, and nobody knew what to say. After dinner, Wren asked to see the account books. Bowen pulled the ledger from the table drawer. Its cover was water-stained, its pages curled the entries written in fading pencil. He set it on the table like a man presenting evidence at his own trial. It is bad, he warned. Real bad. Wren opened it. Her fingers traced the columns of numbers, and this was the moment she began to reveal who she truly was. Not a financial genius, not some prodigy of commerce. A merchant's daughter who had grown up sitting on her father's knee, watching him keep his books, who had learned arithmetic before she learned to sew, who understood money not from any university, but because it was her father's language. She found the truth in those smudged pages. They owed the bank 4 months, not 3, because Bowen had miscounted the payment periods. The interest rate was 9% abnormally high. Late payment penalties compounded. The ranch had once been profitable, but drought, cattle disease, and collapsing beef prices had opened a hole that kept getting deeper. How long do you have? Wren asked, eyes still on the ledger. 3 weeks, maybe less. Wren did not close the book. She flipped backward, started reading from the beginning, slower this time, making pencil notes in the margins. What are you doing? Silas asked from the doorway. He had come back from the forge at some point, silent as smoke. Looking for a solution. Silas laughed, short, bitter. A solution? You do not even know how to split firewood. I do not know how to split firewood, Wren said without looking up. But I know that Mr. Crane is charging 9%, while the standard agricultural lending rate for Colorado Territory this year is 6 to 7. And I know that the apple orchard out there is dropping fruit to rot on the ground, while every pound of dried apple sells for 40 cents in mining towns, where fresh fruit is a luxury. Silence. Three brothers staring at her. Emmett smiled slowly, a look that said, I told you so, directed at Silas. Bowen looked at Wren as if seeing her for the first time. Silas did not concede, but he also did not argue back. My father was a merchant, Wren said finally, raising her eyes. In the lamplight, those cornflower blue eyes burned with something fierce. I grew up surrounded by contracts, interest rates, and negotiations. I may not know how to ride a horse, but I know numbers. And the numbers say there is still a chance. A small one, but it exists. Wren laid out her initial thinking. The apple orchard could produce dried fruit for mining camps and wagon trains. Prairie grass could be baled and sold to cavalry posts. The cottonwood trees along the creek could be harvested for railroad ties. Wild bee colonies near the water could supply honey. 4 revenue streams, none dependent on cattle prices or rainfall. But none of it matters if Crane forecloses before spring, Bowen said. He cannot foreclose in winter, Wren said. The pass will be blocked. No lawyers, no sheriff. Nobody can reach this mountain for 5 months. That gives us time to prepare. When the pass opens, I will be ready for him. The words hung in the air. Wren watched the three brothers process this. Watched the first fragile threads of hope take hold in men who had forgotten what hope felt like. You are assuming, Silas said, his voice like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath, that you will still be here when spring comes. I am not assuming, Mr. Harrow. Wren met his gray eyes without flinching. I am deciding. But there was something else Wren did not know yet. Something hidden in the letters that had brought her across 2,000 miles of America. The words she had loved, the words that had convinced her to leave everything behind, the words that had spoken of loneliness and hope and the need for someone real. Those words had not been written by Bowen, but that secret would keep, for now. The wedding was held the next morning in Leadville. Simple, quick, practical. Reverend Thomas Mills performed the ceremony in a small wooden church that smelled of candle wax and old timber. Henry and Martha Dawson, who ran the general store, served as witnesses. Wren wore her mother's emerald green dress. Bowen wore his father's old suit, slightly too broad in the shoulders because Elijah had been a smaller man than his eldest son. The vows were brief. Both voices trembled. The kiss lasted exactly 2 seconds. Chaste light, barely more than a brush of lips. But when they pulled apart, Wren noticed something. Bowen's lips were warm, and his hands, those rough, calloused, enormous hands that could split wood all day without tiring, shook when they touched the small of her back. This man could swing an axe from sunrise to sunset without a tremor, but a single gentle kiss undid him. That told her everything she needed to know about how long he had been alone. They signed the marriage certificate. Bowen's signature was rough and blocky. Wren's was elegant, precise. 2 different languages, creating something new on the same page. They left Leadville by noon, heading back up the mountain road with supplies loaded in the wagon. The sky was clear. The air was crisp and sharp with the smell of turning leaves. And then the snow began. Not the gentle, decorative snow of Christmas cards. This was Colorado snow at 10,000 feet. Heavy, thick, relentless. The sky went from blue to iron gray in minutes. The wind shifted, biting cold, slicing through clothing like a blade. Snowflakes the size of silver dollars began covering the road in a white blanket that thickened with terrifying speed. Bowen looked at the sky and his face hardened. Too early, he said, his voice tight. We need to get up the mountain. Now. What happened next showed Wren something she would never forget. The three brothers moved as one without a word spoken, a machine assembled and calibrated through 20 years of shared survival. Bowen pushed the horses harder. Silas rode ahead, clearing fallen branches from the road. Emmett wrapped extra blankets around Wren without asking, just doing his green eyes, checking her face for signs of cold. They reached the ranch as the full blizzard descended. 12 hours later, the pass was blocked completely. 3 feet of snow on the road and still falling. Bowen stood at the cabin door, looking out at a wall of white that erased the world. Then he turned to Wren, his amber eyes grave. The pass will not open until April, maybe May. He paused. You are locked in here with us now. Wren looked at the snow, infinite, absolute, indifferent. Then she looked at the small cabin, the 3 enormous men, and the 5 months of winter stretching ahead. Then we had better start preparing, she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. The first days were awkward. 4 people in a space built for fewer circling each other like cautious animals learning to share territory. Sleeping arrangements came first. Bowen gave Wren the large room and moved to the barn loft despite her protests. When you tell me different, he said simply, I will listen. Until then, I sleep fine on hay. Silas went with him out of principle rather than logic. Emmett stayed in the cabin in the bunk room, close enough to tend the fire through the night and far enough to give Wren privacy. Wren understood. Emmett was the only one of the 3 who grasped the social balance. A young woman alone needed to feel safe, and a brother sleeping one thin wall away provided that safety without crossing any line. Work divided itself naturally through necessity. Wren took over the kitchen, and the first real meal she cooked changed everything. It was simple. Stew with onions and potatoes she had brought from Leadville, seasoned with salt, and a pinch of dried thyme she found in a forgotten tin. But the 3 brothers had been eating plain roasted meat and boiled beans for 4 years. When Bowen tasted the first spoonful, he looked up at Wren with an expression she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who had been thirsty so long he had forgotten what water tasted like. Good, he said, 2 words. But the way he said them, low and slow and warm, Wren understood that from bow and arrow, 2 words weighed as much as a whole speech. Silas ate quickly, nodded once stiff but genuine. Emmett ate 2 bowls, asked for a third, and grinned like the sun coming through clouds. In exchange, Bowen taught Wren to split firewood. Early morning, the air cold enough to sting exposed skin. Bowen handed her a smaller axe, the one his father had used, lighter but sharp. Set the wood upright, he instructed, impatient. Aim for the grain line. Lift with your hips, not your arms. Your arms just guide. Your hips provide the force. Wren swung, missed. The wood flew sideways. Silas, passing by on his way to the forge, snorted through his nose. Try again, Bowen said. No impatience, no criticism. The 5th time the axe blade found the grain line and the wood split clean in 2. The sound of it, a sharp, satisfying pop, in the cold morning air rang through the clearing. Wren looked at the 2 halves of wood and she smiled. The first real smile since her father died. Small, unexpected, but true. Bowen saw that smile. And something inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 4 years, began to thaw. Evenings, Wren taught Bowen to keep proper books. She sat beside him at the rough table lamplight flickering between them and guided his big hand through entries and columns. My father taught me that every number tells a story, she said. Income is hope. Expense is reality. Interest is time. If you can read the story, you can control the future. Your father sounds like a wise man, Bowen said. He was. He was also proud, stubborn, and too trusting. Her voice softened. Like someone else I know. Bowen looked up, amber eyes meeting cornflower blue, and the moment stretched longer than it needed to. Then both of them turned away. During those same evenings, while Wren taught Bowen and the lamp burned low, she was also doing something else. She was studying the ledger with a merchant's eye, analyzing every entry, calculating margins, estimating the value of dried apples per pound, the market price of baled grass, the going rate for cottonwood lumber. She was building a battle plan for the day the pass would open and Harlan Crane would come collecting. She would be ready. She wrote letters to her Aunt Margaret in Philadelphia, carefully sealed, waiting for the first opportunity to send them down the mountain. In those letters, she asked her aunt to investigate Crane's land purchases in the region. She did not yet know what she would find, but the merchant's daughter trusted her instincts, and her instincts whispered that a banker charging 9% in a 7% market was doing something more than simple greed. Emmett became her first friend, It happened naturally without effort, the way water finds its way downhill. He taught her to identify the apple trees. Golden russet in the front row, Wolf River in the second, Rome Beauty at the back. He told her about the orchard, how their father had planted it 18 years ago because their mother missed Virginia. Mama grew up with apple trees outside her window, Emmett said, his green eyes going soft. When she married Papa and came out here to this empty mountain, he planted those trees so she would have something from home. Took him 3 years before they bore fruit. She died the winter before the first harvest. Oh, Emmett, I take care of the orchard because somebody has to remember that Papa planted those trees out of love, not profit. Bowen thinks about cattle. Silas thinks about iron. But somebody needs to remember the apple trees. Wren taught Emmett to read better. He knew the basics but struggled with longer words. In the evening, she read aloud from a battered copy of Walden that someone had left in the barn years ago, and Emmett's green eyes would light up with wonder. Words can be that beautiful, he asked. And Silas. Silas kept his distance. He ate, he worked, he went to the forge, he slept. He did not speak to Wren beyond what was necessary. But she noticed something. Every morning when she woke, the wood box beside the stove was full. Someone who did not want to be thanked had carried firewood inside during the dark hours before dawn. She knew it was Silas. She said nothing, but she began leaving a cup of hot coffee on the forge doorstep each morning. No words, no explanation. Just the cup steaming in the cold air. And every morning the cup was empty when she came back for it. This was how Silas and Wren began to speak. Not with words, with firewood and coffee. 10 nights after the snow sealed them in, the bond between all four of them was tested and forged in something real. A pregnant cow went into labor. Early, complicated, dangerous. Bowen came to the cabin at 3 a.m, lamp in hand, snow on his shoulders. I need help, he said. Emmett is checking the herd on the south ridge. Silas is reinforcing the barn doors against the wind. I need another pair of hands. Wren had never helped deliver anything in her life. Not a calf, not a kitten, not a loaf of bread that did not stick to the pan. But she pulled on her coat and followed Bowen to the barn, where a brown cow lay on the straw, her eyes rolling, white with fear, her sides heaving. The barn smelled of hay and animal warmth and the copper tang of blood. The oil lamp threw jumping shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind screamed. Hold her head, Bowen said. His hands moved quickly, confidently. This was where he was not alone, where he was not lost. In labor and the work of keeping life going, Bowen Harrow was complete. Talk to her. Keep your voice low. She needs to know someone is here. Wren knelt in the straw. It poked through her dress fabric into her knees. She cradled the cow's massive head in her arms and whispered nonsense soft sounds. Comforting sounds, the kind of sounds her mother used to make when Wren was small and frightened. Bowen worked. His hands, the same hands that could split wood and build walls and repair anything that broke on this mountain, were gentle beyond anything Wren could have imagined. He guided the calf into the world with the tenderness of a man who understood that life was the most fragile and most precious thing the mountain ever produced. When the calf, tiny and wet and trembling, stood up on shaking legs and pressed its nose against Wren's hand, she laughed. The sound came out of her before she could stop it. Wet, exhausted, wonderful laughter that filled the barn and pushed back against the howling wind outside. Bowen looked at her, hair loose and wild face flushed, red hands smeared with blood and straw, laughing like a child at Christmas. And he thought with a clarity that hit him like a hammer on an anvil, she is not a city girl. She is the thing I did not know I needed. What shall we call her? Wren asked, stroking the calf's damp head. You delivered her, Bowen said. You name her. Hope, Wren said without hesitation. Her name is Hope. Bowen smiled, the first real smile Wren had seen from him. Slow, warm, transforming his severe face into something that made her want to see it again and again and again, every day for the rest of her life. That night, after the calf was settled and the cow was resting, after they had washed the blood from their hands in water so cold it burned, Bowen walked Wren back to the cabin through the snow. Their breath made clouds in the moonlight. The sky had cleared and a million stars burned above the peaks of the Saywatch Range. At the cabin door, Bowen paused. Thank you, he said, for helping tonight, for being here, for... He trailed off, unable to find words for what he meant. For staying, Wren finished. Yes, his voice was rough. For staying. They stood there for a moment that was too short and too long, at the same time two people at the edge of something neither of them could name yet, with the whole frozen mountain holding its breath around them. Then Wren went inside and Bowen went to the barn, and the night settled over Harrow Ridge like a promise waiting to be kept. But Wren did not know that the letters that had brought her here, the beautiful aching words about loneliness and hope and the need for someone real, had not been written by the man she had just married. They had been written by the one brother who could barely look her in the eye. And when that truth came to light, everything she was building in this small cabin on this cold mountain would be shaken to its very foundations. But that reckoning was still weeks away. For now, there was a calf named Hope, a wood stove that needed tending, and the long, slow, uncertain work of four strangers learning to become a family. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The past was sealed. The world was far away. And on Harrow Ridge, something was beginning that none of them had planned for, something that would grow through the winter, like roots beneath frozen ground, invisible and unstoppable, waiting for spring to show itself in full bloom. The mountain did not care about any of it. The mountain never did. But sometimes on the harshest peaks, in the deepest winters, in the most unlikely places, that is exactly where the strongest things take root. A month passed and the world shrank to the size of a clearing in the mountains. Snow lay 4 feet deep around the cabin. The spruce trees bowed under white weight. The creek froze solid, its voice silenced until spring. Beyond the tree line, the peaks of the Sawatch Range vanished into clouds so low and gray, they seemed to press down on the earth itself, as if the sky were trying to crush everything beneath it into something smaller, something quieter, something that would simply stop. There was no town, no neighbors, no news from any world beyond the pass. There were only 4 people, a handful of animals in the mountain, and the mountain did not care whether they lived or died. But they lived. Day by day, chore by chore, and meal by meal, they lived. Wren woke before dawn every morning. She had learned to build a fire without burning down the cabin, though the first attempt 3 weeks earlier had produced so much smoke that Silas had slept sitting upright by the door for 2 nights afterward, watching for flames. She rationed the coffee, carefully calculating how many mornings remained in the sack they had brought from Leadville, and she mixed the batter for rough bread while the stove heated the cabin into something that almost resembled warmth. Bowen came inside after her, stomping snow from his boots, always surprised to find the fire lit and the coffee ready. 4 years alone, and the simple act of someone waiting for him in the morning still hit him like a fist to the chest every single time. He went to the creek with an axe, chopping through 6 inches of ice to fill the water buckets, then checked the cattle in the low pasture, then walked the fence line looking for breaks that the snow and wind had made during the night. Silas was at the forge by the time the sun crested the ridge, repairing tools, shaping horseshoes, fashioning hinges for the cabin door that the wind had torn loose. The sound of his hammer on the anvil was the heartbeat of the ranch, steady and rhythmic and utterly reliable. And Wren had come to find comfort in it the way a child finds comfort in the ticking of a clock. Emmett tended the livestock, cooked alongside Wren when she would let him check the hay stores, braided rope patch saddles, and generally served as the connective tissue that held the household together. Without Emmett, the silences between Bowen and Silas would have been stone walls. With him, they were merely quiet rooms that someone had forgotten to furnish. But it was the evenings that mattered most. After the work was done, the animals were fed and the tools put away, and the last daylight had bled out of the sky, the 4 of them gathered around the hearth. This was when the love story actually happened. Not through kisses, not through declarations, through presence. Wren read aloud from the copy of Walden. Her voice filled the small cabin, and 3 men who had never been read to since their mother died sat and listened with a concentration that bordered on reverence. Bowen sat closest to her, his knee sometimes almost touching hers, his arm resting on the back of her chair, but never quite touching her shoulder. Emmett lay on the floor near the hearth, his long frame stretched out, green eyes closed but never sleeping. And Silas sat farthest away in the corner by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable, but present. Every single night present. And from the man who had wanted her gone, that silent attendance said more than any words could have. One evening in late November, Wren attempted to bake an apple pie. Emmett had described their mother's recipe from memory. Golden russet apples from the front row of the orchard, harvested before the first hard freeze and stored in the root cellar. A crust made from lard and flour, and cinnamon. Mama said cinnamon is like love, Emmett told her. Too little and you cannot taste it. Too much and it overwhelms everything. Just enough is perfect. Wren followed the instructions as closely as she could. The result was a disaster. The crust burned black on one side and remained raw on the other. The filling leaked out through a crack and pooled on the bottom of the stove where it sizzled and smoked. And the cinnamon, far too much of it, hit the back of every throat like pepper. And Emmett sneezed so hard he knocked his coffee off the table. Wren looked at the ruined pie. Then she looked at the three brothers, all of whom were making extraordinary efforts to find something kind to say, and she spoke with perfect deadpan seriousness. In Philadelphia, this would be considered avant-garde cuisine. Emmett laughed first, big, open, genuine laughter that shook his whole body. Then Bowen, a low rumbling sound from deep in his chest, surprised out of him before he could stop it. And then against all probability, Silas. One short, involuntary bark of laughter that escaped him like a bird startled from a bush. His gray eyes widened for a single instant, the hardness cracking before he locked everything back down again. Next time, Silas said, his voice still sharp but somehow less cutting than before. Less cinnamon. 2 words of advice, not criticism. The difference was small. The difference was fundamental. It was after that evening, after the laughter and the terrible pie, and the moment when Silas had almost been human, that Wren discovered the truth about the letters. She could not sleep. The wind howled outside, driving snow against the cabin walls in waves that sounded like ocean surf. She rose to get water, and she stopped in the darkness when she heard voices from the bunk room. Emmett and Silas speaking in low tones they thought no one could hear. "You have to tell her," Emmett said, "about the letters." "There is nothing to tell." Silas's voice was taut as wire. "She deserves to know the truth. She came here because of those letters, Silas, because of the words you wrote." A long silence. Then Silas spoke and his voice had changed. The hardness was still there, but underneath it was something raw, something bleeding. "I wrote them because I believed that somewhere out there, someone would see value in the life we built here. Someone who would look at this mountain and these trees and this cabin and see something worth having." He paused. "Then she stepped off that stagecoach in that blue dress, and I thought I had been wrong, completely wrong." "And now do you still think you were wrong?" Another silence so long that Wren thought he would not answer. Then, barely audible over the wind outside, "No, I think she is the best thing that ever happened to this family. But that is exactly why I cannot tell her. Because if she knew that I wrote those letters, and if she was angry, she might leave. And if she leaves—" "The pass is blocked," Emmett said gently. "She cannot leave. But spring will come, and if she carries that anger into spring, she will go and never come back." Wren retreated into the darkness of her room, heart hammering. Silas wrote the letters, not Bowen. The man who could barely look at her, who had challenged her from the moment she arrived, who radiated hostility, like a forge radiates heat. That man had written, "I do not seek beauty, I seek truth." That man had written, "On the mountaintop, loneliness has a shape. It sits beside you at the fire every night." She lay awake until dawn, listening to the storm, and when morning came, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She did not confront Silas. She did not demand explanations. She did not express anger or betrayal or any of the things that a woman deceived about the authorship of her courtship letters had every right to feel. Instead, she walked to the forge. It was the first time she had gone there. Silas looked up from the anvil hammer, frozen mid-swing, surprise and suspicion warring across his hard features. "What do you need?" he asked. "I want to learn," Wren said. "Can you teach me to forge a nail?" Silas stared at her. He searched her face for the trap, for the sarcasm, for the hidden blade. But she stood there with empty hands and level eyes, offering nothing but the question. "A nail," he repeated. "A nail. Start with the smallest thing." He turned the iron rod on the anvil, considering. Then he nodded once. "Step inside. Do not touch anything until I say." For 2 hours, Silas taught her. He did not waste words. "Hold here. Turn. Harder. No, with your arm, not your wrist." His voice was clipped and precise, and his hands, when they corrected her grip on the hammer, were surprisingly careful for their size and strength. When Wren finally produced a nail, crooked and ugly but solid, Silas examined it under the firelight. Then he looked at her. "You know I wrote the letters," he said. Not a question. "I know." Silence. The forge fire crackled and popped. "Why are you not angry?" Wren looked at the nail in her hand. Rough, misshapen, but hers. "Because those letters brought me here." And here, she looked around the forge, then out through the open door at Bowen mending a fence in the snow at Emmett, carrying hay to the cattle at the white peaks above the tree line. "Here is where I belong." Silas swallowed hard, his jaw clenched and unclenched. Then hoarse and low, "You belong with Bowen. He is a good man. Better than me." "I know he is. And I know that you are better than you think, Silas Harrow." She placed the crooked nail on the anvil beside his perfect ones and walked out. Silas looked at that ugly nail sitting among his finest work, and he did not remove it. He left it there. He would leave it there for the rest of his life. December brought the deepest cold, and with it came a tenderness that grew like ice crystals on a window pane, solely, silently in patterns no one could predict. Bowen repaired Wren's shoes while she slept. The soles had worn thin, one buckle had broken, and the leather was cracking from the dry mountain cold. He sat by the lamp in the barn loft, working the leather with hands more accustomed to splitting logs than stitching seams. And when Wren found the shoes on her doorstep the next morning, perfectly mended, placed beside a small jar of dried wildflowers that Emmett had preserved from autumn, she stood very still for a long time. There was no note. There did not need to be. Wren repaired a tear in Bowen's coat, a rip along the shoulder seam from a taut rope during cattle work. She sewed it with Philadelphia stitching, small and even and nearly invisible, the kind of needlework that her mother had taught her in another lifetime. When Bowen put the coat on and felt the shoulder, his fingers tracing the line of tiny stitches, he looked at her across the room with an expression she had not seen before. Soft, warm, wondering. Silas forged a small knife for Wren. Perfectly sized for her hands, the handle wrapped in soft leather, the blade honed to a razor edge. On the end of the handle, he had stamped a small letter W. He left it on the table when no one was looking. Wren found it and knew immediately who had made it and what it meant. Emmett taught her to ride, starting with the oldest, gentlest horse in the barn, walking slow circles in the snow-packed yard in front of the cabin. Wren fell 3 times. The 4th attempt, she managed 50 feet without falling. Emmett applauded, Bowen nodded from the fence line, and Silas from the forge doorway looked up at exactly the right moment, watched her ride, and turned back to his work. But Wren saw. He had looked. Christmas on the mountain. No gifts to buy, so everything was made by hand. Wren knitted a scarf for Bowen, dark wool, simple, warm. Emmett had taught her to knit with patience that bordered on sainthood. Bowen built her a small bookshelf from pinewood plain, but solid, sanded smooth, the joints fitted with a precision that only a man who worked with his hands could achieve. Silas forged a hairpin shaped like an apple leaf, delicate ironwork that seemed impossible from such large, rough hands. Emmett gave her the copy of Walden wrapped in a piece of clean cloth with "For Wren" written inside the cover in his careful, uncertain handwriting. That evening, the 4 of them sat by the fire. Emmett sang, a low, soft bass voice, a song his mother had taught him, something about a river and going home. The firelight danced. Snow fell silently outside the window. And Wren felt for the first time since her father died that she belonged somewhere on this earth. Bowen stood and offered his hand. "Dance with me." "There is no music," Wren said. "Emmett is singing." And so they danced, slowly, clumsily, in a cabin barely large enough to turn around in while Emmett sang, and Silas sat by the fire pretending he was not watching. Bowen's hand rested on the small of Wren's back, warm and large and impossibly gentle. Her hand lay on his shoulder, small and light, but there, present. They did not speak. They just moved. And in that silence between Emmett's quiet singing and the soft crackle of the fire, something shifted between them that could never shift back. No kiss, no declaration, just knowing. Both of them knowing at the same time that this had stopped being an arrangement. When the song ended, Bowen released her hand. Wren stepped back. Both were breathing faster than the slow dance warranted. "Thank you," Wren whispered. Bowen nodded. Then he went outside into the snow because he needed cold air to put out whatever was burning inside him. February brought the threat. The snow was still deep, but the lower elevations had warmed enough for riders to move along the mountain trails below the pass. And one afternoon, Silas came back from checking the south fence line with a face like granite and eyes like approaching thunder. Hoof prints, he said. 4, maybe 5 horses, not ours. Bowen set down his axe, whereupon along the South Creek, near the low pasture. Every set of eyes in the yard went hard. They all knew who owned horses and hired guns in this part of Colorado. The next morning, they found 5 cattle shot dead in the lower pasture. The carcasses lay in the snow, blood spreading red across white in patterns that looked like something a cruel god had painted. Nobody had taken the meat. This was not hunting. This was a message. Wren stood before the dead animals, her hand pressed over her mouth. She had never seen violence like this. She was a Philadelphia girl, accustomed to scandals fought with paperwork, not blood on snow. Bowen examined the carcasses. Rifle rounds, long-range professional angles. Silas knelt by the tracks, his fingers tracing the hoof prints in the frozen ground. "Brennan," Silas said, "I recognize the shoe pattern. His bay horse has a crooked front right. I shod that horse last summer before I knew who he worked for." Carved into a tree near the dead cattle, hacked deep into the bark with a knife, were 2 words: sell or burn. Bowen looked at Wren, then at his brothers. Then he made his decision with the swift finality of a man who had been making hard choices since he was 19 years old. "Emmett, you stay with Wren. Do not leave the cabin. Silas, get the rifles." "Bowen," Wren started. No, his voice did not allow argument. "This is not Philadelphia. Out here, when someone shoots your cattle, you do not write a letter of complaint. You find them." He looked at her, and in his amber eyes there was no anger, only an absolute, unshakable protectiveness that Wren had never seen directed at herself before. "Stay with Emmett. I will come back." Bowen and Silas rode out, 2 dark figures on horseback against the white snow, 2 men riding toward danger, because that is what you did when someone threatened your family. Wren watched them disappear into the tree line and felt something tear open inside her chest. 2 days, the longest 2 days of Wren's life. She and Emmett kept watch. Emmett slept lightly, a shotgun within arm's reach. Wren did not sleep at all. She sat by the window through the long mountain night, staring into the darkness, listening for hoofbeats, for gunshots, for any sound that would tell her whether the 2 men she had come to need were alive or dead. "They will be fine," Emmett told her, sitting beside her on the second night, his big hand resting gently on her shoulder. Bowen and Silas grew up on this mountain. They know every rock, every tree, every game trail. Nobody knows this land the way they do. "I am scared," Wren admitted. "I am scared of losing them. I only just found them, and I cannot bear to lose anyone else." "You are family now, Wren, and the Harrow family does not let each other down." On the 3rd morning, 2 riders appeared at the edge of the tree line. Wren was out the door before Emmett could stop her, running through snow that came up past her knees, her breath coming in ragged clouds. They were whole, exhausted, frost-bitten, grim, but whole. They had tracked Brennan's men to a camp in the lower valley. The riders had already pulled out, but they left behind evidence of Harlan Crane's involvement in a second message carved into a trail marker. "Last warning." Bowen dismounted. His face was raw from wind, his coat crusted with ice, his eyes heavy with 2 days without sleep. And Wren ran to him. She did not think. She did not calculate. She simply ran, and she pressed her face against his chest, and she held on. Bowen froze. 1 second of complete stillness. Then slowly, as if learning the motion for the very first time, his arms came up and closed around her, gently, carefully, as if he were holding the most precious thing in the world and was terrified of breaking it. "I am here," he whispered into her hair. "I am safe." That was the first embrace. It lasted 30 seconds, and it changed everything. 3 weeks later, the worst blizzard of the season struck without warning. Wren had gone to check the chicken coop for eggs. The sky was clear when she stepped outside. 60 seconds later, it was a white wall. Wind screaming at 60 miles an hour. Snow so thick she could not see her own hand when she held it in front of her face. She was 200 steps from the cabin. In a whiteout, 200 steps might as well be 200 miles. Bowen realized she was missing 20 minutes into the storm. He searched the cabin, the barn, the forge. The chicken coop door was open, swinging in the wind. Empty. "She is out there," Bowen said, and the calm in his voice was the most frightening thing Silas had ever heard from his brother. It was the calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and what it might cost him. You cannot go out in this, Silas said, gripping his brother's arm. This storm kills in 30 minutes. You will get lost too. Bowen took a length of rope, tied one end to the porch post, tied the other around his waist. If I am not back in 1 hour, pull the rope. He walked into the white. 40 minutes. 40 minutes of nothing but wind and snow, and a rope growing heavy with ice, and the knowledge that somewhere in this frozen blindness, the woman he loved was dying. He found her curled against the base of a spruce tree 100 yards from the cabin. She was shaking violently, her lips blue, her eyes beginning to drift. Hypothermia. She had perhaps 20 minutes before unconsciousness. He lifted her. She weighed nothing in his arms. He followed the rope back hand over frozen hand, the wind shoving against him like a living enemy, snow scouring his face raw. But Bowen Harrow kept walking. Every step. He did not stop. Inside the cabin, Silas had water heating. Emmett had blankets ready. When the door burst open and Bowen staggered through with Wren in his arms, both of them white as ghosts, Emmett wrapped her in wool while Silas stoked the fire until the cabin was almost unbearably hot. Bowen set her beside the hearth, wrapped her in every blanket they had, and took her hands between his own. Her fingers were white cold as creek stones. He breathed warm air onto them, slow and steady, the way you warm a newborn bird that has fallen from the nest. You are here, he said, his voice cracked and raw from the wind and from something deeper. You are safe now. It was the first time he called her anything other than her name. The word he used was so quiet she almost missed it, but she heard it. She heard the shift from formality to something that had no walls around it. Wren looked up, her eyes still glassy from the cold focused on his face. Snow melting in his hair, kin red and burning from the wind. Amber eyes bright and wet and not from the wind. You rode through the storm, she whispered. For me. I rode through the storm because I could not stand the thought of you being out there alone. He paused, then each word heavy as mountain stone. I rode through the storm because my life does not make sense anymore without you in it. Wren raised her hands, still trembling from the cold, and touched his face, cold fingers on warm skin. Bowen closed his eyes and leaned into her palm. I love you, Wren said. I think I have loved you since the night we delivered hope in the barn. Since you smiled at me for the first time and I thought that is the man whose smile I want to see every day for the rest of my life. Bowen opened his eyes, amber wet, no longer hiding. I love you, he said, and his voice broke on the last word. I have loved you since you split that first piece of wood and laughed. Before that, I had forgotten what laughter sounded like. He kissed her, and this was not the 2-second ceremony in the Leadville church. This was a kiss earned through 4 months of labor and silence and slow, patient learning. It tasted of coffee and cold air and the salt of tears and something else, something that had no name except perhaps the future. The door to the bedroom closed softly behind them. Outside, the blizzard raged, but inside at last, everything was warm. When morning came, the storm had passed. Sunlight poured through the cabin window, catching the ice crystals on the glass and scattering tiny rainbows across the rough log walls. Wren woke to find Bowen's arm around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that her old life was finished. From that morning forward, everything was different. Everyone could see it. Bowen smiled more. Wren touched his arm without thinking. Emmett teased them gently, you two are insufferable, and grinned while saying it. And Silas, without a word, forged a second hook by the cabin door at exactly the height where Wren could hang her coat without stretching. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But they both knew what it meant. Spring was coming, and spring would bring the opening of the pass and with it Harlan Crane and a reckoning that had been building all winter long. But it would also bring something else, something Wren carried inside her. Now a secret she was not yet ready to share, a new life, growing in the silence the way seeds grow beneath snow, invisible and patient and certain. The hardest part she knew was not behind them. It was ahead. But for the first time in her life, Wren Whitfield Harrow was not facing it alone. April came to the Saywatch Range the way forgiveness comes to stubborn men. Slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow began to pull back from the meadows like a white tide retreating, revealing earth so dark and rich it looked almost black. Water ran everywhere, pouring off the peaks in silver threads, filling the creek. until it roared with a voice that had been silent for 5 months. The spruce trees shook their white burden from their branches and stood straighter, greener, reaching for a sun that now lingered in the sky an hour longer each day. And the apple orchard bloomed. Wren stood on the cabin porch on a morning in mid-April, and the sight of it stopped her breath entirely. The trees her dead father-in-law had planted 18 years ago for a wife who missed Virginia were covered in blossoms. White and pale pink, thousands upon thousands of them, trembling in the mountain breeze, releasing a perfume so sweet and clean, it seemed to wash the last trace of winter from the air itself. Bees had already found them. Their hum filled the orchard like a hymn. Beautiful, Wren whispered, and she remembered saying the same word on her first day in Leadville 6 months ago. But that had been the wonder of a stranger. This was something different. This was the wonder of a woman who had survived the winter to see it, who had earned the spring. Bowen came up behind her. He did not speak. He simply stood, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and together they watched the orchard bloom in the early light, and neither of them needed to say what both of them were thinking, that his father had planted those trees out of love. That love, if you tended it, kept bearing fruit long after the hands that planted it were gone. There was no more time for stillness. The pass was open, and that meant Harlan Crane could reach them. Wren had spent the entire winter preparing. Every evening by lamplight, while she read to the brothers, her mind had been working through numbers, strategies, angles of attack. She had filled the margins of the old ledger with calculations so precise they would have made her father proud. She had written letters to Aunt Margaret in Philadelphia, sealed and waiting since November, asking for information about Crane's land purchases across the region. Now those letters could finally travel down the mountain. She gathered the three brothers at the table and laid out her plan. Not in the language of banks and boardrooms, but in the plain speech of a woman who had learned to split wood and deliver calves and survive a Colorado blizzard. The orchard fruits in September, she said. We dry the apples, package them, sell them to the mining camps where fresh fruit does not exist, and a pound of dried apple is worth more than a pound of silver ore to a man who has not tasted sweetness in 6 months. Prairie grass we bale and sell to the cavalry post at Fort Garland. Cottonwood along the creek we harvest for railroad ties. The wild bees give us honey, 4 streams of income, none of them depending on cattle prices or rain. And Crane, Bowen asked. Crane is a numbers problem. I solve numbers problems. You three solve the ranch. Trust me. Trust, Bowen said. Trust, Emmett said. Silas looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then, do not make me regret it. You will not regret it, Silas Harrow. 2 weeks after the pass opened, Wren rode down the mountain to Leadville. Alone. Bowen had argued against it with every ounce of his stubborn will, and Wren had met him with every ounce of hers, and in the end she won because she was right, and they both knew it. If you are there, she told him, Crane will talk to you, not me. He will see the man, not the argument. But if I go alone, he has no choice but to hear what I am saying. And what I am saying will save us. She wore her mother's emerald green dress, washed, mended, still carrying the faintest ghost of wood smoke from 5 months of cabin life. But it was the dress her mother had worn, and her mother's mother, before that, and Wren put it on like armor. Leadville savings smelled of tobacco and paper and the particular staleness of rooms where men made decisions about other people's lives. Harlan Crane sat behind his mahogany desk, gold spectacles, gleaming vest button, hair oiled. He looked like a man who had never set foot outside a building, and perhaps that was exactly what he was. Mrs. Harrow, genuine surprise crossed his face. I was not aware Bowen had married. We married in October, the day before the snow closed the pass. Wren sat down, removed her gloves with deliberate precision, and placed a sheaf of papers on his desk. And I am here because we need to discuss what you are owed and what you are charging for it. She made her case. Not with the jargon of finance, but with the clarity of arithmetic that could not be argued with. Foreclosure costs you $300 minimum. Selling the property in this market, assuming you find a buyer at all nets, you perhaps $500. Your profit, if everything goes perfectly, is $200. Meanwhile, the property sits vacant, costs you money, generates nothing. She tapped her papers. Alternatively, give us 5 months of interest-only payments at 7% instead of your current 9%, and we repay the full principal with interest. You receive everything you are owed with no risk, no cost, no effort. Which option puts more money in your pocket? Mr. Crane, Crane studied her papers. The clock on the wall ticked through a silence that lasted nearly 2 minutes. 5 months, he said finally. 7%. Final offer. Agreed. They shook hands and Wren saw something behind his spectacles that was not respect, but was perhaps its distant cousin. Calculation. Reassessment. The recognition that she was not what he had expected. But as she left the bank, stepping into the bright mountain sunlight, with her knees shaking beneath her skirt, Wren heard Crane call his man Brennan into the office. And through the closing door, she caught two sentences that turned her blood to ice water. Follow her and find out everything you can about Frederick Whitfield of Philadelphia. The past was not done with her yet. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of Wren's life, and the most dangerous. In late May, 3 weeks after Wren's negotiation with Crane, they woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke from the stove, but the thick, oily stench of something burning that should not be burning. Bowen was out the door before Wren could sit up, and what he saw stopped him cold in the yard. The barn was on fire. Not a small fire, not a spark from a lantern left burning. The flames climbed the eastern wall in a sheet of orange and gold, fed by something that burned too fast and too hot to be natural. Kerosene. Someone had doused the wall and lit it while they slept. What followed was 2 hours of desperate choking work. All four of them, hauling water from the creek in every bucket and pot they owned, beating at the flames with wet blankets, pulling livestock out through smoke so thick it turned the moonlight brown. By dawn, the barn was a blackened skeleton, half its roof gone hay stores, destroyed tools melted or ruined. But the cabin still stood. The forge still stood. And every animal was alive because Emmett had dragged the last terrified cow out through a wall of smoke with nothing but a rope and a prayer. Silas found the kerosene tin near the tree line. Beside it, boot prints he recognized. Brennan. Bowen stood before the smoking ruin and said nothing for a very long time. Then he looked at Wren, and his amber eyes held something she had not seen before. Not defeat, not fear, certainty. The certainty of a man who has just learned exactly what he is willing to fight for. We rebuild, he said, bigger, stronger, and Crane answers for this. They rebuilt the barn in 3 weeks, working from dawn until their hands bled. Henry Dawson rode up from Leadville with lumber and nails refusing payment. You helped me with my storeroom roof last spring, he said. Debts go both ways. Other ranchers came too, men who had heard about the fire and recognized Crane's hand in it, men who had their own grievances against the banker and his hired guns. The new barn rose from the ashes larger and stronger than the one before it, and the fact that a community had built it together meant more than the structure itself. And Wren, watching the beams go up, watching neighbors she barely knew sweat alongside her family, understood something that would become the foundation of everything she built afterward. Crane's weapon was isolation. He destroyed people one by one, family by family, because alone they were weak. Together they were a wall he could not break. She began writing letters that very night, not just to Aunt Margaret, to every family Crane had squeezed, to every rancher who had lost land to his foreclosures, to the lawyer in Denver. The fire was meant to break them. Instead, it gave Wren the evidence she needed and the anger she needed to use it. They threw themselves into the work of transformation with a fury that the fire had only sharpened. Bowen built drying racks from scrap lumber, cleared deadfall from the orchard. Silas forged every tool they needed, blades and frames and hinges, each one made to Wren's exact specifications without her having to ask twice. Emmett tended the orchard with a devotion that bordered on prayer, pruning and clearing, and coaxing the trees toward the abundant harvest that Wren's calculations demanded. And Wren managed everything: the planning, the numbers, the correspondence with merchants in Leadville, the letters to Fort Garland about grass contracts, the careful rationing of their remaining cash. She worked from before dawn until after dark, and she did it with a fire in her belly that had two sources. One she shared with everyone and one she had not yet spoken aloud. In August, a letter arrived from Aunt Margaret in Philadelphia. Wren read it on the cabin porch, and her hands trembled so violently that she had to set the pages down and press her palms flat against her knees. The letter contained two pieces of information that would change everything. First, the good news. Aldridge, the partner who had framed her father, had been caught embezzling from another company. During the investigation, he confessed to everything, including the fabrication of evidence against Frederick Whitfield. Her father's name had been officially and completely cleared. The newspapers were printing retractions. The court had issued a full exoneration. Second, the news that changed the shape of her entire future. Her father's estate, his bank accounts, his property, his investments, all of it was being restored. Aunt Margaret estimated the total value at approximately $15,000, an enormous sum, enough to buy half of Leadville, enough to return to Philadelphia, live in comfort, rebuild the Whitfield name in the society that had destroyed it, enough to leave. Wren sat with the letter in her lap and watched the mountains and felt the world spin beneath her. Bowen found her there an hour later. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly over the longer words, and when he finished, his face became stone. "You should go," he said. His voice was flat, dead level. The voice of a man building a wall with every syllable. $15,000, Philadelphia. Your father's name restored. You deserve that life. Do not tell me what I deserve, Bowen Harrow. I am not telling you what to deserve. I am saying what makes sense. $15,000 compared to this. He gestured around the cabin, the new barn still smelling of fresh pine, the broken fences. There is no comparison. Wren stood up. Her eyes burned not with tears, but with a fury that Bowen had never seen and would never forget. "This," she said, her voice shaking, "is my home. You are my husband. Silas and Emmett are my family. I did not cross 2,000 miles and survive a Colorado winter and deliver a calf named Hope and learn to split firewood and forge a nail and ride a horse through snow to walk away because a number on a piece of paper is bigger than I expected. Wren, listen to me. No, you listen. You are pushing me away because you are afraid. Afraid that if I have a choice, I will not choose you." She stepped toward him. "Every person I have ever loved has been taken from me. My mother, my father, my home, my name. And now you want to give me away too because you think you are not enough." Bowen looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, calloused hands that had never held anything gently until her. His shoulders, those massive shoulders that could bear the weight of timber and cattle, and the whole crushing weight of his father's failed dream were shaking. "I am scared," he said, and the admission cost him something that showed in his face like a physical wound. "Everyone I have loved has left. My mother, my father. And now you have every reason in the world to go. Why would you stay?" Wren put her hands on his face, her small fingers on his rough jaw. She made him look at her. "The money stays here," she said, "invested in this ranch, in Whitfield Harrow Provisions, in a bigger cabin, in a future for our family." She paused. "Our growing family." Bowen went still. His eyes dropped to where her hand rested almost unconsciously against her stomach. Understanding crossed his face like dawn, breaking over the Sawatch peaks, slow and golden and irreversible. "You are," he began. "2 months, Wren said. "I have known for 3 weeks. I was waiting for the right moment, and I suppose watching you try to throw me away qualifies." Bowen Harrow, who could swing an axe from morning to night, who could ride through a blizzard, who could face armed men on horseback without flinching, trembled from head to foot. Then he pulled her to him, gently, so gently, as if she were made of something more fragile than glass, and he held her for a very long time. "I am staying," Wren whispered against his chest. "I choose you, every day, forever." The harvest came in September, and it exceeded every projection Wren had made during those long winter nights of calculation. 90 pounds of premium dried apples, sliced thin, dried on the racks Bowen had built, packaged in cloth bags that Wren had sewn, stamped with their brand. Whitfield Harrow Provisions. The name of 2 fathers, one who had built with wood and one who had built with numbers, united on a bag of dried fruit at 9,000 feet. Henry Dawson at the Leadville General Store took 30 pounds and paid cash up front. "Best quality I have ever carried," he said. "The wagon trains will fight over these in." A man named Wick Calloway, a wagon master, who provisioned 3 trains each season, bought the remaining 60 pounds and placed an advance order for 300 more the following year. "I have been looking for a reliable supplier for years," he told Wren. "You have yourself a contract." Captain Ford at Fort Garland signed an agreement for baled grass and dried fruit, both payable quarterly, renewable annually. By the time the leaves turned gold on the aspens that October, Whitfield Harrow provisions had generated enough revenue to make 4 mortgage payments, stock the cabin for winter, and invest in expansion for the following spring. But Wren was not finished. The letters from Aunt Margaret had continued arriving through the summer, and each one added another piece to the picture Wren had been assembling in her mind since the day she first looked at Crane's interest rate and thought, this is not greed. This is strategy. Margaret's contacts in Philadelphia had uncovered what Wren suspected. Crane had been buying land across the region for 2 years, every parcel along the projected route of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad extension. He had inside information about the railroad's plans, information not yet public, and he was using his position as banker to force landowners into default so he could acquire their property at a fraction of its future value. The interest rates, the penalties, the foreclosure threats, none of it was random. It was systematic fraud. Wren hired a lawyer in Denver named Thomas Garrett, paying from her father's restored estate, and Garrett confirmed what the documents showed. Crane had committed federal crimes. The evidence was sufficient for investigation and prosecution. The town meeting was held on a Saturday evening in October in the Leadville Church. The entire community attended. Henry and Martha Dawson sat in the front row. Captain Ford came in full uniform. Reverend Mills opened the proceedings. Thomas Garrett stood beside Wren with a leather case full of documents. Harlan Crane sat in the middle of the room, Walt Brennan at his side, looking confident in the way that men look confident when they believe their power is still intact. Wren stood before them all in her emerald green dress, the dress she had married, in the dress she had worn to her first negotiation with a Crane, her mother's dress, and she spoke clearly. I came to Leadville 8 months ago with nothing but desperation and hope. You welcomed me, you helped me. Tonight I stand here to repay that kindness with the truth. She presented the evidence piece by piece. The illegal interest rates, the pattern of land purchases along the railroad route, the correspondence between Crane and railroad officials, the testimony of Jake Dawson, who had seen Brennan's riders near the Harrow Ranch before the cattle were shot, the kerosene tin found beside boot prints after the barn fire, the carved threats, the pattern of intimidation and fraud that stretched across 2 years and a dozen families. Crane stood, his face reddening. And who is making these accusations? The daughter of Frederick Whitfield, the Philadelphia embezzler. Bowen stepped forward, filling the aisle with his shoulders. Her father was fully exonerated by the Philadelphia courts. The documentation is here for anyone who wants to see it. Emmett stood on Wren's other side. Wren Whitfield Harrow is the finest person I have ever known. She came here with nothing and built something real. She saved our ranch, created jobs for this town, brought products to market that people across the territory are paying good money for. If that is what a fraud looks like, then I will take fraud every day of the week. Silas moved forward from the back of the church, and the room seemed to contract around him. He did not speak to the crowd. He looked directly at Crane and then at Brennan, and his gray eyes held the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he will do if pushed. Brennan looked at Silas, and Brennan sat down. One by one, the families Crane had damaged rose to speak. Tom Wheeler, who had lost his ranch the previous year. The Patterson family forced to sell at 1/5 of their land's value. Old Morrison, whose wife had died of grief after they lost their homestead. Each story, each voice added another stone to the wall of evidence that buried Harlan Crane. The vote was unanimous. A formal request for federal investigation into the operations of Leadville Savings. Crane did not leave the church in handcuffs. That would come later, when the federal marshals arrived. He simply sat in his chair as the room emptied around him, his gold spectacles reflecting the lamplight, his careful empire collapsing in silence. Wren found herself behind the church afterward, leaning against the wooden wall crying. Not from sadness, from release. Every lesson her father had ever taught her every evening, spent watching him work his ledgers, every negotiation she had listened to from behind a parlor door, all of it had led to this room on this night in this mountain town. "Papa," she whispered to the darkness. "I did it." Silas found her there. He did not speak. He leaned against the wall beside her, shoulders touching, and stared at the stars the way he always stared at things, as if daring them to disappoint him. After a while he said, "The letters I wrote. I said I was looking for someone real. Not beautiful, but true. I remember. I was wrong." Wren looked at him, surprised. Silas was still watching the stars. You are both. Then he walked away into the darkness, and Wren stood there with tears still wet on her face and a smile breaking through them. Bowen found her last. There you are. Here I am. Let us go home, he said. Home. And the word had never tasted so sweet. The mortgage was paid in full by December. Wren and Bowen stood in the reorganized bank, now managed by a fair man named Robert Collins, and received the deed to Harrow Ridge free and clear. The land was theirs, absolutely and completely. Two fathers, Wren said, holding the paper. One built the land, one taught me how to keep it. Their son was born in April as the orchard bloomed for the second time under Wren's care. Frederick Bowen Harrow came into the world healthy and loud with his mother's blue eyes and his father's iron will, evident from the way he gripped Bowen's finger and refused to let go. Silas brought his gift 3 days later. He carried it into the cabin wrapped in a blanket, and when he set it down and pulled the covering away, Wren could not speak. A cradle, forged from iron and fitted with oak, the metalwork curved into the shapes of apple leaves, each one hammered with a precision that seemed impossible from hands that size. At the head, he had stamped 3 letters, FBH. At the base, in the smaller script, guarded by steel and love. Wren ran her fingers along the iron leaves. Tears fell on the dark metal. It is strong, Silas said, his voice rough, his throat working. Strongest thing in Colorado. Nothing can break it. He was not talking about the cradle. Everyone in the room knew he was not talking about the cradle. Bowen put his hand on his brother's shoulder. One squeeze. No words needed. Emmett predictably wept. Who is cutting onions? He said, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, fooling no one. The years that followed were hard and good, and full the way years are supposed to be. Rebecca Wren's cousin from Philadelphia came to visit in the second summer and never left. She had Wren's head for business and Margaret's eye for opportunity, and within a year she was managing half of Whitfield Harrow Provisions. The way Emmett looked at Rebecca and the way she blushed when he smiled at her was a story that everyone on the mountain could see coming, except the 2 people it was happening to. They married on a June evening under the apple trees, and Silas served as best man, which meant he stood silently beside his brother and nodded once, and everyone understood that this was the Silas Harrow equivalent of a 4-hour toast. Aunt Margaret invested in the business and used her Philadelphia connections to open eastern markets. Dried apples from the Saywatch Range began appearing on shelves in Philadelphia and New York, stamped with the Whitfield Harrow name. 3 more children followed Frederick, 2 daughters and another son. The cabin grew with them, room by room, year by year, but the original logs that Elijah Harrow had laid with his own hands remained the core, the heart, the foundation that everything else was built around. The railroad came just as Crane had predicted, but Crane was in a federal prison and could not profit from it. The Harrow land increased in value 20-fold, but the family never sold. This was home. Colorado autumn, 1920. Bowen Harrow sat on the porch of the house that had grown from his father's cabin over 42 years. His hair was white. His back was not as straight as it had been, but his hands were still large, still calloused, still capable, and his amber eyes still held light, slower now but steady. Wren sat beside him. 65 years old, her hair silver mixed with the last traces of gold, her face beautiful in the way that only a face which has been fully lived in can be beautiful. Their hands were intertwined on the armrest of the chair Bowen had built for her 30 years ago, the same way they had been intertwined on 1,000 evenings before this one. A boy sat on the porch steps below them. Frederick Jr., their grandson, 10 years old with his grandmother's blue eyes. Tell me the story, Grandpa. The one about Grandma coming on the stagecoach. Bowen looked at Wren. Wren smiled, and after 42 years, that smile still made the old man's heart lose its rhythm for half a beat. Your grandmother. Bowen began, his voice deep and slow and warm, like a creek running over smooth stones. Arrived in the autumn of 1878, in a navy blue dress made in Philadelphia, her hair pinned up with city pins, white gloves on her hands, and I thought I had made the worst mistake of my life. Why be ya? Because she was small, because she looked like she would blow away in a strong wind, because she had never split a log or ridden a horse or seen snow like Colorado snow. Bowen squeezed Wren's hand, and I was wrong, completely, absolutely, magnificently wrong, because your grandmother was the strongest person I have ever known. She saved this ranch. She saved me. She saved this whole family. We saved each other. Wren corrected the same way she had corrected him 1,000 times over 4 decades. Where is Uncle Silas? The boy asked. At the forge. Where else? And it was true. From the forge 30 yards away, the sound of a hammer on an anvil still rang out slower than 42 years ago, but just as steady. Silas, 73, white-haired, slightly stooped, still worked iron every single day. And on his anvil, beside his finest work, there still sat a crooked, ugly nail that a young woman from Philadelphia had forged on a winter afternoon when she chose to answer hostility with grace. He had never moved it. He never would. And Uncle Emmett, in the orchard with Aunt Rebecca. Emmett, 70, was somewhere among the apple trees, the original trees and the new ones he and Rebecca had planted together over 39 years of marriage. 5 children, 11 grandchildren. He still tended the orchard every morning, still talked to the trees, still believed with his whole gentle heart that his father's legacy lived in their roots and branches. Bowen looked out across the valley, his land free and clear, stretching hundreds of acres across the mountainside. The big barn rebuilt after Brennan's fire, larger and stronger. The healthy cattle. The sign over the gate, Whitfield Harrow Provisions, a company that Wren had grown from a wild orchard and a stubborn refusal to quit, now supplying dried goods across half of Colorado. The boy ran off to play, and Wren leaned her head against Bowen's shoulder. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard, the same scent that had greeted them every spring for 42 years. Would you do it all again? Wren asked. She asked every year on their anniversary, and every year Bowen gave the same answer. Every single time, every version, every lifetime. Even the part where you walk through the blizzard, especially that part. He kissed the top of her silver head. Because that was the night I knew, really knew, that you were my home, not the cabin, not the land. You. Wren held his hand, both their hands weathered now, scarred by time and work and weather, and she held on tight. From the forge, Silas's hammer rang steady and true. From the orchard, Emmett's laughter carried on the wind. On the porch, 2 old people sat together in the light of a setting sun, watching the mountains that had tested them and shaped them, and finally blessed them, and they did not need to speak, because after 42 years, there was nothing left to say that had not already been said 1,000 times, in 1,000 ways, with words, and without them, in every season, through every storm, across every morning, when one of them woke and found the other still there. The secret, Wren would tell her grandchildren years later, was not luck. It was not brilliance. It was not money. The secret was that we refused to quit. We trusted each other completely. And we built everything, every log, every nail, every pound of dried apples, every smile in the middle of a blizzard together. 1 woman, 3 brothers, 1 mountain, and a love built by hand. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing. 42 years later, sitting on the porch, he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers. She thought that was the day my real life began. And Bowen beside her, his rough hand warm around hers, thought the same thing. He had thought it every day for 42 years. He would think it every day for however many years remained. Because some truths, once you find them, never wear out. They only grow deeper, like roots beneath a mountain, holding everything together through every season, through every storm, through every long and beautiful and improbable year. The sun went down behind the Sawatch Peaks. The sky turned gold, then amber, then the deep violet of a Colorado evening. Stars appeared one by one, the same stars that had burned above them on the night they danced in a tiny cabin while Emmett sang. And on Harrow Ridge, the light in the cabin window burned warm and steady, the way it had burned every night for 42 years, the way it would burn for generations to come. A small light in a vast darkness. But enough, more than enough, it was everything.